When the Union Army seized control of Davidson County in February 1862, they requisitioned dozens of abandoned properties for military use. Most had been left in disarray, furniture overturned, documents burned, valuables hastily removed by fleeing Confederate sympathizers. The process was routine. Soldiers would sweep through empty estates, catalog remaining assets, and convert suitable structures into barracks, hospitals, or supply depots. But the Harwell estate, 17 miles southeast of Nashville along the Cumberland River Valley, presented something different. The three-story manor stood untouched, as if its occupants had simply vanished mid-Rhine. Breakfast plates remained on the dining table, food long since rotted. A leather journal lay open on the study desk, ink dried in the middle of an unfinished sentence, clothing hung in wardrobes, books lined library shelves. A grandfather clock in the entrance hall had stopped at 3:47, its pendulum silent. Captain William Morrison of the 3rd Ohio Infantry was among the first to enter the property. His initial report, preserved in National Archives records, described the scene as peculiarly undisturbed, as if the residents departed with intention to return momentarily. He noted the quality of furnishings, the extensive library of agricultural and scientific texts, and what he termed an atmosphere of abandonment that exceeded typical wartime evacuation. For 3 days, Morrison's company used the manor as temporary headquarters while scouting surrounding territory. Soldiers slept in the bedrooms, cooked in the kitchen, used the study for planning sessions. It was only on the 4th day, February 19, 1862, that Private James Ketchum, foraging in the root cellar for preserved foods, noticed something unusual. The cellar was large, approximately 40 feet by 30 feet, with stone walls and a packed earth floor. Along the walls sat rows of storage shelves holding empty canning jars, broken pottery, and burlap sacks. Ketchum was moving these sacks, hoping to find potatoes or turnips beneath them. When he discovered that the floor in one corner sounded hollow when struck, he called for assistance. 2 other soldiers helped him clear the area, removing sacks and debris. Beneath they found a wooden hatch approximately 3 feet square with an iron ring handle. The hatch was secured by a heavy sliding bolt, rusted but intact. Ketchum pulled the bolt free and lifted the hatch. The smell that emerged made all 3 men recoil, a fetid combination of human waste, decay, and stale air that had been trapped underground for months. Ketchum dropped the hatch and retreated, gagging. One of the other soldiers vomited. Captain Morrison was summoned. When he arrived, he ordered lamps brought and peered down through the opened hatch. A wooden ladder descended into darkness. He called down. Silence answered. Morrison ordered Private Ketchum to descend. The young soldier, visibly reluctant, climbed down with a lamp, while Morrison and 3 others watched from above. What Ketchum found in that underground darkness would haunt him for the rest of his life. His testimony, given to a military investigator 6 days later, describes entering a chamber carved from bedrock approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. The air was thick and foul. His lamp illuminated crude sleeping pallets along the walls, waste buckets in one corner, and an overturned water barrel. And then he saw the children, 8 of them, huddled in the far corner of the chamber, filthy and skeletal, shielding their eyes from the lamplight. They were dressed in rags, their hair was matted, their skin showed lesions and infections. Some had visible injuries, broken bones healed incorrectly, scars from untreated wounds. When Ketchum called out to them, none responded. They simply stared, faces blank, eyes reflecting lamplight like animals in a cave. I thought at first they might be dead. Ketchum testified, animated corpses of some kind. They did not move except to shrink from the light. They made no sound. One of the older girls was rocking back and forth, her mouth moving but producing no words. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was scratching at the wall with his fingernails over and over in a repetitive motion that seemed to have no purpose. Ketchum climbed back up the ladder and reported what he had found. Morrison descended personally to verify. When he emerged 15 minutes later, his face was ashen. "Get the surgeon," he ordered immediately. It took 3 hours to coax the children out of the underground chambers. They were terrified of the soldiers, terrified of the light, seemingly unable to comprehend that they were being rescued. When the surgeon, Dr. Albert Hayes, finally examined them in the manor's parlor, he found conditions that defied his medical experience. His report, written February 21, 1862, and later submitted to the Prost Marshal's office in Nashville, documented 8 children between apparent ages of 12 and 16. Though their actual ages, he noted, might be younger given their stunted growth. All exhibited severe malnutrition with body weights 40 to 60% below expected norms, rickets from vitamin D deficiency due to lack of sunlight exposure, skin conditions, including dermatitis, fungal infections, and discoloration, dental decay, and gum disease, multiple untreated injuries, some recent others, older and poorly healed respiratory infections from prolonged exposure to damp conditions, severe. Yes, psychological trauma including mutism, catatonia, and dissociative behaviors. 2 of the children could not walk without assistance. 3 could not speak coherently. All exhibited what Dr. Hayes termed extreme fear responses to basic environmental stimuli, flinching at loud sounds, cowering from sudden movements, refusing to make eye contact. But it was Dr. Hayes's examination of the underground chambers themselves that revealed the full horror. In addition to the main room, Hayes discovered 3 adjoining chambers connected by narrow passages. One contained 12 sleeping pallets, crude constructions of wood and straw arranged in rows. A second contained sanitation facilities, buckets, a drain hole, and what appeared to be an attempt at a primitive washing station. The third was the most disturbing. A small room barely 8 feet square containing a chair, a desk, and observation slits cut into the wall at eye level, allowing someone in that room to watch the main chamber without being seen. On the desk, Hayes found a leather-bound journal. Inside were dated entries meticulously written, documenting what the author called the Controlled Development Protocol. The entries began February 12, 1856. Hayes also found 2 bodies. They were in the sleeping quarters chamber, laid out on pallets covered with thin blankets. Both were children or had been. Decomposition was advanced but not complete, suggesting death had occurred within the past 3 months. Hayes could not determine cause of death through field examination, but noted evidence of prolonged illness and physical deterioration consistent with the conditions observed in survivors. Captain Morrison immediately ordered a full investigation. He assigned guards to the property. He secured all documents found in the manor, including multiple journals, ledgers, and correspondence. He had the 8 surviving children transported to a contraband camp established for formerly enslaved people liberated by Union forces, where Dr. Hayes continued their medical treatment. And he sent an urgent dispatch to his commanding officer in Nashville describing what had been discovered and requesting instructions. What followed was a military investigation, testimony from witnesses, examination of documentary evidence, and ultimately a decision by federal authorities to suppress almost all information about the case. The official record mentions only irregularities in the management of enslaved persons at a plantation property in Davidson County. The investigation file was sealed and classified. Officers who participated were instructed not to discuss their findings. The detailed medical reports, witness testimonies, and documentary evidence were collected, archived, and forgotten. But the truth pieced together from fragments that survived the suppression. A few preserved letters, marginal notes in official documents, one partial medical report rediscovered decades later, and testimony given by elderly veterans in the 1890s reveals something that authorities in 1862 deemed too horrific for public knowledge. This is that truth. This is what happened at the Harwell estate between February 1856 and November 1861. This is the story of Edmund Harwell, a man who believed he was conducting scientific research. And this is the story of 12 children who suffered in darkness so profound that some never truly emerged from it, even after rescue. Edmund Harwell was not born evil. Understanding what he became requires understanding what he was. a dangerous combination of intelligence, ambition, and a complete absence of empathy that manifested slowly over years. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1814, Edmund was the only child of Marcus Harwell, a schoolmaster who operated a small private academy for the children of merchants and minor professionals. Marcus was a rigid, cold man who valued intellectual achievement above all else. He taught his son Greek and Latin before age 8, mathematics and philosophy before 10. Affection was expressed through academic approval. Failure was met with disappointment so profound that young Edmund learned to fear it more than physical punishment. Edmund's mother Sarah died when he was 6 years old. Marcus never remarried, never spoke of her, removed all her possessions from their home, as if erasing her existence. Edmund learned that loss was something to be managed through emotional detachment, that sentiment was weakness. By age 14, Edmund had surpassed most of his father's other students. Marcus began preparing him for university, drilling him in sciences and natural philosophy. But here was something concerning in the boy's intellectual development, a fascination not with knowledge for its own sake, but with knowledge as a tool for control. When Edmund was 15, Marcus discovered that his son had been conducting experiments on stray animals, not crude torture, but methodical studies of behavior modification through environmental manipulation and reward-punishment conditioning. Edmund had filled 3 notebooks with observations about how cats and dogs could be trained to perform specific actions through controlled stimuli. Marcus's response was revealing. He did not punish Edmund. Instead, he engaged him in discussion about scientific methodology, about the importance of careful documentation, about how to conduct research without attracting negative attention from people who wouldn't understand the value of objective inquiry. This was Edmund's true education, not that his experiments were wrong, but that they needed to be conducted with discretion. At 17, Edmund enrolled at East Tennessee University, later renamed the University of Tennessee, to study agricultural science. The field was experiencing rapid development in the 1830s. Scientific farming was replacing traditional methods. Planters who adopted modern techniques, crop rotation, soil chemistry, selective breeding, achieved dramatically higher yields than their neighbors. Edmund excelled. He absorbed everything: botany, chemistry, engineering, animal husbandry. But his professors noted something unusual in his approach. While other students were interested in understanding natural processes, Edmund was interested exclusively in controlling them. His thesis paper, submitted in 1836, was titled Environmental Determinism in Agricultural Production, Eliminating Variable Factors to Maximize Yield Optimization. The paper was technically brilliant. It was also, several professors noted privately, disturbingly cold in its reduction of all living systems, plants, animals, and by implication, humans, to input-output mechanisms that could be engineered for efficiency. Edmund graduated with honors. He was 22 years old, academically accomplished, and socially inept. He had few friends. He showed little interest in typical young male pursuits: drinking, gambling, courtship. His passion was optimization, methodology, control, and he needed resources to pursue his interests. In 1841, Edmund met Louisa Kenton at a social function in Knoxville. She was 20 years old, the only daughter of Charles Kenton, a tobacco merchant whose business was failing due to a combination of poor investments and declining health. Kenton owned a 600-acre property in Davidson County, purchased years earlier when tobacco prices were high, now mortgaged and barely productive. Edmund recognized opportunity. He courted Louisa with methodical precision, not with passion, but with carefully calculated demonstrations of stability and competence. He spoke about agricultural science, about modern farming methods, about potential returns on properly managed land. He was, in effect, selling himself as a business proposition. Louisa was intelligent but naive, educated in music and literature, but sheltered from commercial realities. She saw in Edmund a serious, accomplished man who seemed capable of providing security in uncertain times. She accepted his proposal after a 4-month courtship. They married in March 1842. Charles Kenton, relieved to have his daughter settled and desperate for financial assistance, transferred ownership of the Davidson County property to Edmund as part of Louisa's dowry, along with the existing mortgage debt and all assets, including 43 enslaved workers. Edmund was now a plantation master. He was 28 years old, and he finally had the resources to implement his theories. The property he inherited was in poor condition. The previous owner, Kenton's business partner, who had managed the plantation before his death in 1840, had been incompetent. Fields were exhausted from years of growing the same crops without rotation, equipment was broken, buildings were deteriorating, the enslaved workforce, poorly fed and overworked, was demoralized and unhealthy. Edmund saw not a disaster, but a controlled experiment. Here was a system in complete disarray, perfect for testing his optimization theories. He began with meticulous documentation. He created a ledger system that tracked every aspect of the operation: crop varieties planted in each field, weather conditions, soil composition, fertilizer applications, yield per acre. He catalogued equipment and created maintenance schedules. He inventoried every asset down to the last nail. And he began documenting the enslaved workforce with the same meticulous detail he applied to crops and equipment. In 1842, most plantation owners viewed their enslaved workforce as general labor, interchangeable units to be assigned tasks based on immediate need. Edmund considered this approach wastefully inefficient. He created individual files for each of the 43 people he now legally owned. Each file contained physical characteristics: height, age, estimated age, notable features, health assessment, chronic conditions, injuries, physical capabilities, skills, inventory, prior experience, demonstrated aptitudes, learning capacity, behavioral observations, temperament, cooperativeness, relationships with others, productivity metrics, work output, quality of work, consistency. He spent 3 months conducting what he called initial assessment and categorization. He observed people working, interviewed them, though calling these one-sided interrogations interviews is generous, tested their abilities with different tasks, and documented everything. Then he implemented his system. He divided the workforce into specialized groups. Field workers further subdivided by crop type, skilled craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers, domestic staff, animal handlers, maintenance workers. He assigned each person to tasks that matched their documented capabilities, but he went further. He implemented what he called a performance-based resource allocation protocol, essentially a merit system where workers who exceeded productivity targets received marginally better conditions, slightly more food, slightly less brutal working hours, occasional small privileges like Sunday afternoons for rest. This was not kindness, it was behavioral engineering. Edmund had studied animal training techniques and understood that reward-based conditioning was often more effective than punishment-based systems. He designed his plantation operations around this principle. The results from a purely economic standpoint were remarkable. Within 2 years, crop yields increased by 40%. Equipment maintenance improved, reducing breakdown costs. The workflow RCE, responding to the incentive structure, became more productive and showed fewer disciplinary problems. Neighboring planters noticed. By 1845, Edmund's reputation as an innovative agricultural manager was spreading through Davidson County. He was invited to speak at regional agricultural societies. He published articles in farming journals. Letters arrived from plantation owners asking for consulting advice. Edmund's social status rose. The awkward, cold academic became a respected expert. Louisa, meanwhile, managed the household and social obligations, hosting dinners for neighbors, maintaining correspondence with family, fulfilling the role of plantation mistress with competent grace, if not enthusiasm. Their marriage was not affectionate, but functional. They occupied separate bedrooms, they conversed about household management and social obligations, but rarely about personal matters. Louisa knew her husband was unusual, distant, obsessively focused on his work, showing more emotion about crop yields than about human relationships, but she accepted this. Marriage for people of their class was an economic and social arrangement, not necessarily a romantic one. What Louisa did not fully understand, because Edmund carefully concealed it, was that her husband viewed everything and everyone around him as components in systems to be optimized, including her, including the people they enslaved. And increasingly, his interest was turning toward a question that would eventually lead to horror. Could human behavior itself be optimized through environmental engineering starting from childhood? In 1847, Edmund attended a regional agricultural conference in Nashville, where he heard a presentation by a professor from the University of Virginia about breeding livestock for specific traits. The professor discussed how environmental conditions during early development could influence adult characteristics, how horses raised in specific training environments develop different temperaments and capabilities than those raised without structured conditioning. Edmund became fixated on this idea. If animal behavior could be shaped through developmental environment control, why not human behavior? He began researching everything he could find about child development, education theory, and what was then called mental philosophy. He corresponded with academics, purchased books on pedagogy and psychology, read controversial European theories about environmental determinism, and he began observing the children on his plantation with a new interest. By 1848, there were 19 children under age 12 among the enslaved population, some born on the property, others acquired when Edmund purchased additional workers to expand operations. These children lived in the quarters with adult family members, helped with age-appropriate tasks, and generally grew up within the traditional structure of enslaved community life. Edmund saw wasted potential. These children, he believed, were being raised in what he termed chaotic developmental environments that would produce suboptimal adult workers. Their skills and behaviors were formed randomly through imitation and unstructured experience rather than through systematic conditioning. What if, he wondered, children could be raised in carefully controlled environments with every aspect of their development managed to produce specific outcomes? What if you could engineer workers who were not only physically capable but psychologically optimized for obedience, productivity, and specialized skills? He began drafting plans for what he called a juvenile training facility. In 1849, he converted an unused storage building into dormitory space for children. He announced to the enslaved community that children over age 6 would be separated from families for educational purposes and skills training, presenting this as a progressive measure that would prepare them for more valuable work roles. The reaction was predictable horror. Parents pleaded to keep their children. They were refused. Edmund had legal authority to do whatever he wished with his property, including separating families. 17 children were moved into the new dormitory in May 1849. Edmund hired through intermediaries to avoid revealing his true intentions a tutor from Knoxville, a young man named William Crane, who needed money and was willing to teach enslaved children basic literacy and mathematics without asking too many questions about the overall program. Edmund established rigid schedules: wake at dawn, morning exercises, basic education, skill training in specialized tasks, afternoon physical labor appropriate to their ages, evening meal, then what Edmund called socialization period before bed. To outsiders who heard about this arrangement, it seemed potentially enlightened, a plantation owner investing in workforce development through education and training. Some neighboring planters even praised Edmund's forward-thinking approach, but the reality was something else entirely. The education wasn't meant to enlighten these children, it was to condition them. The socialization periods were observation sessions where Edmund watched how children interacted, documenting their behaviors, testing different group dynamics to see what produced the most compliant results. He kept meticulous notes on each child: how they responded to authority, how they performed under pressure, which incentives motivated them, which punishments modified their behavior most effectively. He was treating them as laboratory subjects, running experiments on developing minds, and he was learning. Over 3 years, Edmund refined his understanding of how children could be conditioned, shaped, controlled. He became convinced that traditional child-rearing was fundamentally inefficient, that optimal human development required scientific management. By 1852, he had developed a comprehensive theory. He believed that human behavioral plasticity was greatest during childhood, that this period represented a unique opportunity for engineering specific traits, and that traditional developmental environments introduced too many confounding variables. Parental influence, peer interactions, uncontrolled experiences that corrupted the conditioning process. What was needed, he concluded, was environmental purity, total control, complete elimination of random influences. He began designing a more radical experiment, an experiment that would require complete isolation, an experiment that would need to be hidden from everyone, even from people on his own plantation who might object or report what they witnessed. An experiment underground. In early 1853, Edmund began planning construction of what he described in his journals as the optimal developmental environment. Meant a space where children could be raised under conditions of complete environmental control. He spent months considering the design requirements. The space needed to be isolated, completely separate from external influences, hidden from casual observation, controlled. Every environmental factor, light, temperature, sound, had to be manageable, sustainable, capable of maintaining subjects for extended periods with minimal intervention, observable, allowing him to monitor and document without constant direct interaction. His solution was subterranean construction. Underground chambers would provide natural temperature stability, complete isolation from external light and sound, and perfect concealment if properly disguised. In May 1853, Edmund commissioned what he described to workers as an underground cold storage expansion for the existing root cellar. He hired a mason from Murraysboro who specialized in bedrock excavation for basement construction, a Taston man who did quality work and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Edmund supervised personally but revealed minimal information. He claimed the expansion was for storing increased crop yields, that he wanted sophisticated cold storage to improve food preservation. The mason had no reason to question this. Wealthy planters often invested in elaborate property improvements. The work took 7 months. Slaves from the plantation performed the heavy labor, excavating rock, hauling debris, mixing mortar, but they worked in rotating shifts, ensuring no single person understood the full scope of the project. Edmund carefully managed information flow, showing workers only the specific tasks they needed to perform without reverend. Ealing the overall design. By December 1853, the construction was complete. Beneath the existing root cellar, accessible through a concealed hatch that Edmund had the carpenter install and camouflage, lay a network of chambers carved 15 feet into Tennessee bedrock. The main chamber, 20 FTX, 30 feet, 8 feet ceiling. This would be the primary living space. Edmund installed oil lamps in fixed ceiling mounts with control ropes extending up through concealed channels to the root cellar above, allowing him to control lighting without entering the space. He created a ventilation system, narrow shafts drilled at angles through the rock, emerging in wooded areas 50 yards from the manor where they would go unnoticed. The shafts were too small for anyone to climb through, but adequate for air circulation. The sleeping chamber connected to the main room by a low passage 15 feet by 20 feet. Edmund had sleeping pallets constructed, 12 of them arranged in rows. Each was a simple wooden frame with a straw-stuffed mattress. He installed storage shelves for clothing and personal items. The sanitation chamber, a small room 10 feet square containing wooden buckets for waste, a drain hole that emptied into a naturally occurring underground crevice, and a washing station with a water barrel. The design was crude, but functional based on prison architecture Edmund had researched. The observation station. This was the most revealing design element. A small room 8 feet square, accessible only from the root cellar above, through a separate passage. The room connected to the main chamber via narrow observation slits cut at eye level. Someone sitting in this room could watch the main chamber while remaining completely hidden. and silent. Edmund furnished the chambers with basic necessities: wooden stools, a central table, a cabinet for storage, buckets, ropes, and basic tools. He installed a pulley system for lowering supplies, a rope and basket mechanism that allowed him to deliver food and water without entering the space. He also installed a speaking tube, a pipe system connecting the observation station to the main chamber, allowing him to address subjects without being seen. The entire design reflected Edmund's core philosophy: total environmental control. Every element was engineered to give him maximum authority over the subject's experience while minimizing their ability to influence their own conditions. In January 1854, the chambers were complete. Edmund furnished them with books he had carefully selected, religious texts emphasizing obedience and acceptance of one's station, basic educational materials, nothing that might encourage independent thinking or questioning of authority. And then he waited. The chambers sat empty for 2 years. During this time, Edmund continued running the plantation, managing the children's training program, and planning the next phase. He was waiting for the right subjects. He was waiting for conditions that would allow him to proceed without too much risk of discovery or interference. And he was waiting for the psychological state that would allow him to actually implement what he had planned. That state arrived in March 1855 when Louisa died. Louisa Harwell went into labor on March 8, 1855. It was her first pregnancy. She was 34 years old, not dangerously old by the standards of the time, but not young either. The pregnancy had been difficult. Louisa had suffered from persistent illness, fatigue, and swelling. Dr. Nathan Pierce, the nearest physician, attended the birth at the Harwell manor. Labor began in the evening and continued through the night. By morning, it was clear something was wrong. The child was malpositioned. Louisa was weakening. Dr. Pierce attempted forceps delivery, a dangerous procedure even in skilled hands. The child, a boy, was delivered stillborn at 11:40 a.m. on March 9th. Louisa, hemorrhaging and exhausted, died approximately 2 hours later. Edmund's response to this double tragedy was not conventional grief. Several people who saw him during the days following, Dr. Pierce's neighbors who paid condolence calls, the minister who conducted funeral services, noted his unusual affect. He showed no tears. His voice remained steady. He spoke about the deaths in clinical language, as if discussing crop failures. "It is regrettable." He told one neighbor that medical science has not advanced sufficiently to prevent such outcomes. Perhaps in time, with proper research and methodology, such losses will become preventable. Dr. Pierce found Edmund's coldness disturbing, but attributed it to shock. The minister suggested Edmund might be suppressing grief through stoic resolve. Neighbors whispered that he had always been strange, and this tragedy had simply revealed his true nature. None of them understood what was actually happening. Edmund's detachment wasn't grief suppression. It was his natural state. He had never loved Louisa, not in any conventional sense. She had been a functional component of his life system, and now that component had failed. He felt not sadness, but irritation at the disruption to his ordered existence. But Louisa's death did trigger something significant: philosophical radicalization. In the weeks after the funeral, Edmund retreated into his study with his journals and books. He began writing extensively about determinism, control, and human development. His entries from this period show a mind tipping from methodical coldness into something more actively dangerous. "Nature is chaos," he wrote on March 24, 1855. "Birth, death, disease, all random, wasteful, inefficient. But human intelligence can impose order. We need not accept natural outcomes when we can engineer better ones. The farmer who allows crops to grow wild is a fool. The planter who allows workforce development to occur randomly is similarly foolish. And the man who accepts that human potential is fixed by chance factors rather than amenable to systematic optimization is denying the core premise of scientific progress." He began corresponding with practitioners of discredited pseudoscientific disciplines, phrenologists who claimed skull measurements could predict behavior, early practitioners of what would later become psychology who were experimenting with controversial methods. He read everything he could find about sensory deprivation, isolation studies, environmental conditioning. By autumn 1855, Edmund had convinced himself of several dangerous propositions. 1. Human behavior and capability were almost entirely products of environmental conditioning during childhood developmental periods. 2. Traditional child-rearing environments were chaotic and suboptimal, introducing random variables that prevented proper development. 3. Optimal human development required environmental purity, total control of all influences on the developing mind. Such optimization was not just possible but morally justifiable as advancement of scientific knowledge. He began planning to activate the underground chambers he had constructed 2 years earlier. He would need subjects and he would need a selection methodology. Between October and December 1855, Edmund spent weeks observing the children on his plantation. He attended their training sessions. He watched them during work periods. He reviewed his extensive files documenting their characteristics and behaviors. He was looking for specific criteria. His journals from this period list his selection requirements. Age 6 to 10 years old, young enough to be maximally susceptible to conditioning, but old enough to survive without constant care that would require excessive intervention. Physical condition, generally healthy, free from obvious disabilities or chronic illnesses that might compromise the experiment or require medical treatment he couldn't easily provide. Psychological profile, tractable temperament, demonstrated capacity to follow instructions, not prone to extreme emotional reactions that might destabilize group dynamics. Social isolation. This was the most revealing criterion. Edmund specifically wanted children with minimal attachment to adult family members, those who had been separated from parents through sale, orphans, or children from families Edmund had deliberately fragmented over the years. This last criterion reveals Edmund's awareness that what he planned would be easier if there were fewer people likely to persistently question where the children had gone. By January 1856, he had identified his subjects. Group 1. The recently acquired 3 boys and 2 girls from groups purchased within the past year, separated from their parents during sales in Virginia and Kentucky. These children had arrived at the plantation already traumatized by sale and separation. They had no family connections on the property. Their absence might be noticed, but there would be no one with the emotional investment to persistently demand answers. Group 2, the orphaned, a brother and sister, ages 8 and 6, whose mother had died from fever in August 1854. Their father, a field worker named Samuel, was assigned to the farthest fields and saw his children infrequently under Edmund's deliberate work scheduling. The children had been living in the communal children's dormitory for over a year. Group 3, the communally raised, 4 children born on the estate but raised according to Edmund's collective child-rearing protocol that he had implemented in 1849. These children had been separated from birth mothers at young ages and raised in group environments with minimal individual parental contact. Edmund had designed this system partly for efficiency, but also, as his journals reveal, as an early conditioning experiment. Group 4, the deliberately isolated 1 girl, age 9, whose family Edmund had sold to a plantation in northern Mississippi in September 1855. He had orchestrated this sale specifically to create an isolated child for his selection pool. The girl's name was Dinina, and she had been living in the children's dormitory since her family's departure, confused and grieving. 12 children in total. Edmund assigned them numbers in his journals. He stopped seeing them as children long ago. In his private records, they were labeled Subject 1 through Subject 12. No names, no identities, only specimens. By February 10, 1856, Edmund had completed his final preparations. The underground chambers were fully stocked: dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, and barrels of water. Selected books were arranged neatly on shelves. He tested the lighting system, the pulley mechanisms, and the ventilation shafts. Everything worked perfectly. There would be no mistakes. Edmund began before dawn. At sunrise on February 12, 1856, he entered the children's dormitory and calmly informed William Crane, the tutor, that 12 students were being transferred to a specialized training program in a separate facility. Crane, hardened by years of service and trained never to question Edmund's decisions, simply nodded. He asked nothing. Edmund then turned to the 12 chosen children and ordered them to gather their personal belongings. They obeyed silently, unaware that this would be the last time they would ever see the light of day. Agar upko asidak, disturbing our hidden historical stories pasand hain. To Black Rite stories ko abhi subscribe Karain our bell icon zaror dabayen. Comment section. Mine zaror likhain ke aap kis country se dek rahe ho hum ha comment read. Karte hain